welcome to another Thursday lunchtime lecture. It's really wonderful to be welcoming you all here today. So we're really excited today because we are joined by Dr. Johanna Dale, who works with the University College London, who's going to be talking to us all about St Oswald. Now, before I hand you over to our Chief Executive, Peter Reyes, I'm just going to give a quick tech overview for how these lectures work and how you will be able to get the most out of them. So a particular warm welcome to those of you who are joining our lecture for the first time. It's really wonderful to be welcoming you all, and thank you for tuning in. So the best thing for you to do to get into our lectures really easily is to make sure that you both like and follow the Church's Conservation Trust on Facebook. If you do that, that will trigger Facebook to send you a direct notification for whenever we go live with these lectures. It's completely free of charge. And as I said, all you need to do is just like and follow us. We'll post a link, though, which gives a free guide or a video that you can watch, which gives you a step-by-step guide for how you can take part in these lectures. Now, these lectures are always free of charge to watch and take part in. We don't charge you for them. They're not hidden behind any paywalls. So if you see anyone commenting with any links during this lecture saying you can watch elsewhere, please don't click them because they're likely to be spammers. And as soon as we see spammers, we do delete and block those accounts. So you can only watch them live on our Facebook account. But always remember, we never charge, so we don't ask for credit card details. Now, one of the great things about these lectures is that there is always plenty of time and opportunity for you to ask our guest lecturer your questions. So if you have any questions that pop into your head throughout this course of this lecture, do comment away and we'll do our best to put those questions to Johanna at the end of the lecture. Now, if you've missed out on any of our previous lectures, you can also watch those, and they're all available free of charge to watch, and we'll shortly be posting a link to our Facebook playlist as well as to our YouTube channel where you can watch those for free. Now, if you like these lectures and you want to show some support, please do like the videos, do share them with your friends and family, go onto our events page where you can see upcoming lectures, do sign up for those, but do invite friends and family along to them, because it's really great to see so many people, and especially so many regulars joining us week after week. So please do, the more the merrier. Now, you can also support us in a couple other ways. You can send a text donation. So if you think these lectures are have some real value and you're enjoying them, please do consider supporting our work in caring for historic churches across England. Now, you can do this in a couple of ways. You can firstly donate through our website, which is visitchurches.org.uk, and you can donate completely securely through there. You can also text donate. So if you've got your mobile phones with you right now, you can text CCT to 70331 to give us a gift of £3. But if you think these lectures are worth more than £3, why not text CCT to 70970 to give us a gift of £5. Now, finally, if you join us as a member by direct debit, and that's just £3.50 a month, you will be sent a free copy of this book, which is Beautiful Churches by Matthew Byrne. And this shows some of just the churches that we've saved in our 50 years of being in existence. It really is a wonderful book. And I know those of you who have already taken us up on this lecture offer have given us really wonderful feedback saying how much you like the book. But it's got wonderful facts and stories, 4 pages of beautiful colour images. As I said, if you join us by direct debit and use the code lecture on our offer code, so when you join up on our website, there's an offer code area. Make sure you just type in lecture in capitals. You will be sent a free copy of this. Now, if you've got any questions, any problems, do comment, but also do use that direct message button, send us a message, and we'll do our best to help you out. But that's all for the moment for me. But I'm going to pass you on to our Chief Executive, Peter Reyes, who's going to tell you a bit more about our work at the Trust and what we've been up to.
Hello, everybody. It's lovely to see you all those who are coming back and all of those of you who are new to us. I think I'm picking up a great theme through the comments that actually the music is agony to your ears before you have the dulcet tones of our very well-informed and intelligent lecturers coming through. I am reassured by the team that they are changing platforms soon, and we should be able to sort that music out at the beginning. But it would help us if you donated, you see, because that would help us to be able to afford a better platform to do it. Did you see what I did there? So you're always welcome to donate to the Trust or join us indeed. But for those of you who don't know us, we're a charity. We've been around for 50 years, and we were set up specifically to deal with and look after historic church buildings of the Church of England that were no longer needed for regular worship. And over time, we've collected a collection of 356 of these, and we take on about 2 or 3 more every year. We have no idea what the impact of COVID might be. It might be that more churches need our help, but actually we're set our strategy up to be something about how we can actually empower local communities to keep hold of these buildings themselves rather than other people owning them, because they have a profound relationship with the place that they are. They're the most democratic of historic buildings because they tell a story of absolutely everybody, and they're very much intrinsic to the English landscape. So please do support our work. With your help, we can do even more. As George said, you can donate by text, you can join us with by direct debit and get that free book. But also there's a free newsletter you can sign up to if you wanted to as well. But we really appreciate your attendance, and we're very grateful for everything that you do. It's been quite a challenge at the moment with COVID. We have faced a massive loss of income because a lot of our work's aimed at local events in local churches. So there is a need for us to raise some more money this year. We are very lucky though. We have been benefiting from some of the cultural recovery funding, and we're grateful to the DCMS, the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, and Historic England for the funding they provided towards repairs of our churches. And we've got about 20 projects on site at the moment, desperately trying to finish before the 31st of March. But we've had to contribute 20% of that funding as well. So any donations are gratefully received. But let's move on to Johanna Dale, Dr. Johanna Dale, who's doing our lecture today. We're very grateful to all of our lecturers who provide their services for free, which is fantastic of them. And I'm very interested in the subject of today's lecture. And I have been promised lots of body parts and a romp across Europe at the end. So, you know, there's something to live up to there. So Dr. Johanna Dale is a British Academy postdoctoral fellow in the Department of History at University College London. And she works at the intersection of political and cultural history in the Middle Ages, with a particular focus on medieval England and German-speaking lands. Now, her first book, which is the Inauguration and Liturgical Kingship in the Long 12th Century, this is her first book, was shortlisted for the Historical Society, the Royal Historical Society's 2020 Whitfield Prize. Now, she played this down to me beginning, but I think that's pretty impressive. And the good news is for all of us is that actually it's going to come out in paperback in April. It's published by Boydell and Brewer. So we look forward to that coming through. At the moment, her current research project investigates the influential cult of St Oswald of Northumbria and the role of liturgy within it. So we're going to find out quite a lot about St Oswald's many heads. So thank you again, Johanna, and over to you.
Pleasure, and thank you for the warm introduction. Right, how do we do the screen share then now? Screen share, PowerPoint, play from the start. Is that working, George? Perfect. Excellent. Well, as Peter said, this lunchtime, I'm going to be talking to you about Oswald. We're going to talk a little bit about the historical King Oswald, but mostly I'm going to be talking about his afterlife, which I find a bit more interesting. He was recognised as a saint soon after his death, and his cult doesn't just stay in the northeast of England, but it spreads very widely. There are at least 80 pre-Reformation churches dedicated to Oswald, and one of these were predominantly in the north. They weren't exclusively in the north. The CCT cares for 2 churches with Oswald dedications, one which is right at the south of Oswald's former kingdom of Northumbria at Kirksandall in Yorkshire, and the other one is in Gloucestershire at Lassington, and we'll come later to why there's a church in Gloucestershire dedicated to Oswald. Oswald's cult's also not confined to England, and it spreads overseas. And in this talk, I'm mostly going to be focusing on Oswald in England and in Germany, which are the kind of 2 countries I'm most interested in. So let's start with the historical King Oswald. He's born in about 603 or 604 into the Bernician royal family. What becomes Northumbria is made up of these 2 sub-kingdoms, Bernicia and Deira. But he's exiled to Ireland when he's about 13. His maternal uncle, Edwin, killed his father, so off Oswald goes. And he converts to Christianity under Irish influence. He's probably baptized at Iona, which remains an important place for him. In 634, he returns to England and he fights the heathen king Cadwallon at a place that Bede calls Heavenfield, which is just north of Hadrian's Wall near Hexham. And there's a famous story about Oswald erecting a cross on the battlefield that Bede tells us about. When King Oswald was about to give battle to the heathen, he set up the sign of the Holy Cross and, kneeling down, asked God that he would grant his heavenly aid to those who trusted in him in their dire need. The place is pointed out to this day and held in great veneration. It is told that, when the cross had been hurriedly made and a hole dug to receive it, the devout king with ardent faith took the cross and placed it in position, holding it upright with his own hands until the soldiers had thrown in the earth, and it stood firm. And with this cross imagery, we can see Oswald being portrayed as a kind of Northumbrian Constantine, if you like. And on the side of the screen there, you can see Oswald depicted in a 13th century manuscript, holding that cross that he'd erected on the battlefield and treading on Cadwallon, the king he's defeated. Now, Oswald subsequently unites those two different parts of Northumbria, Bernicia and Deira, and he also exerts his influence outside of Northumbria. He marries into the royal family of Wessex, for example, and he acts as godfather to his father-in-law, who is baptized by St Marinus. Now, soon after he's won this battle, Oswald requests from Iona a bishop to Christianize his people. And this is the main reason, I think, really for Bede framing him in such kind of a powerful way, why he's so important to Bede. And he gets Aidan sent. Aidan comes from Iona, and they found together the bishopric at Lindisfarne. So on Aidan's arrival, the king appointed the island of Lindisfarne to be his see at his own request. As the tide ebbs and flows, this place is surrounded by the sea twice a day like an island, and twice a day the sand dries and joins it to the mainland. And of course, Lindisfarne becomes an extremely important centre, Christian centre, is associated with amazing production like the Lindisfarne Gospels. Bede presents Oswald as being absolutely integral to this Christianization. Oswald is said, for example, to have acted as interpreter for Aidan, so Aidan only speaks Irish and Bede interprets for him so that the people could understand his preaching. Oswald builds lots of churches and monasteries. He finishes the stone church at York, started by Edwin. Now, a very notable incident that occurs during his reign, which is described by Bede, is something that happens at an Easter feast one year. And this has a very big impact on the king's posthumous cult, so it's an important story. Oswald and his bishop Aidan are sitting at the Easter feast one year, and Oswald is so overcome by pity for the poor that have come to beg for food that he doesn't just distribute food, but he also breaks up the silver platter on which the food has been served and distributes that to the poor too. At which point Aidan, who's so impressed by the king's generosity, stretches out his arm and touches Oswald on the right arm and says, "Let this arm never rot." And Bede tells us that's what happens. Oswald's arm never rots, and this becomes important later on. Oswald's reign starts with a big battle and it ends with a big battle too. It came to an end on the 5th of August in 642 when he meets his death at the hands of forces led by Penda of Mercia, somewhere Bede calls Matterfelt, which is possibly, probably, depending on who you believe, modern day Oswestry in Shropshire. And Peter mentioned I'd be talking about body parts, and indeed Penda dismembers Oswald's body on the battlefield, and he sticks his head and his arms onto stakes and leaves them on the battlefield. And this division of the bodies to have a really important significance on the spread of Oswald's cult, as we should see. Now, Masterfeld, like Heavenfield, quickly seems to become a site of devotion to Oswald. And I think it's important, these two open-air sites, because they show that there's a real popular element to this cult. And some of Bede's early miracle stories show this. For example, he tells us a story of a traveller riding along whose horse gets colic and starts writhing on the ground, rolling over and over. And then when he rolls on the spot where Oswald dies, he's miraculously healed and the horse jumps up again and is absolutely fine. But we can see here yes, kind of popular interest in Oswald right from the start. But soon it starts to be a more ecclesiastically promoted and controlled kind of a cult, because a year after his death, his brother and successor Oswy retrieves Oswald's head, arms and hands from the stakes on the battlefield. His head is taken to Lindisfarne, his incorrupt right arm to Bamber, and about 50 years later, the rest of his body, and we're not told where it is before then, gets moved to Bardney in Lindsey by Oswald's niece Osthryth, who has married a king of Mercia. And Bede tells us that at first the Bardney monks don't want to accept Oswald's body because Oswald was a foreign king who had exerted power over Lindsey, and they don't want this alien king in their monastery. So the body has to stay outside the monastery for a night, but during that night it is illuminated by a pillar of light, a column of light, and after having seen this miracle, the monks in the morning think, oh, we better bring the body in after all. And so that's how it gets admitted. And Bede tells us about several healing miracles that happen at Bardney. And I think what's particularly key about Bardney is that we start to see the first step in Oswald's cult spreading outside of Northumbria, albeit it's with the support of a member of the Northumbrian royal family. And we also see that it's the physical relics, this part of his body, which is so important to the cult spreading. And none of these body parts stay where they originally were taken to. In 909, Oswald's bones were retrieved from Bardney, which was then part of the Danelaw, and translated to Gloucester. This was done at the instigation of Ethelfled, Lady of the Mercians, and her husband Ethelred, and it's been interpreted by scholars as an attempt by them to kind of boost their prestige and make a very important religious centre at Gloucester, which shows you that already by the early 10th century, Oswald's a very popular saint. In the 12th century, this turns into an Augustinian priory, and the ruins that you can see in Gloucester are of this later priory, but you can see here on the screen some fragments of early West Saxon stonework from the site do survive. This Gloucester translation again shows the importance of the material relics in moving the cult, and the fact that Oswald had been cut up on the battlefield meant there's lots of things to move around. And this is the context of the CCT church at Lassington being dedicated to Oswald. It was almost certainly a pre-conquest possession of St Oswald's of Gloucester. So let's go back up north and to Oswald's head, which was taken from Lindisfarne. Viking incursions eventually forced the monks to flee the island of Lindisfarne with the body of St Cuthbert, who's of course the great northern saint, their famous former bishop. The monks wander for several years. They settle briefly at Chester, and they then move on to Durham, where they settle in 995. At the beginning of the 12th century, the magnificent cathedral is finished, and Cuthbert's coffin was opened, and Oswald's head is found inside of it. And that's why we often find Cuthbert shown carrying Oswald's head, as in this late medieval Durham manuscript. You can see him there. An attribute he's often shown with is Oswald's head. And at Durham, although he does, even I have to admit, play second fiddle to Cuthbert, Oswald's cult really begins to develop. A full office for the celebration of his feast was first put together in Durham. This is what we call a proper office, with chants specifically written from the king. It's not a generic liturgy, but a specific one for Oswald. And a monk called Reginald also wrote a new life, a kind of biography of Oswald. Now, this is heavily based on Bede, but it also includes additional miracles associated with Oswald that have happened subsequently, and also some additional stories. And one that I'm going to come back to later is that Reginald tells the story that when Oswald's arm and head are still impaled on the battlefield, a great bird swoops down and picks up his incorrupt right arm, flies off to an ash tree and drops the arm. And where he drops it, a spring comes up, a healing spring. So we see there are some new stories about Oswald developing as well. Now, that Oswald was important at Durham isn't really surprising. He was the founder of Lindisfarne, and the Durham monks very much saw themselves as the heirs to that Lindisfarne tradition. He'd been king in their region, he's relevant to them locally, and they had his head, which is, an important thing. Although perhaps surprisingly, the head itself never seems to be associated with miracles. And actually, the most important relic of Oswald isn't his head, but his incorrupt right arm, that Easter feast story that I told you about. And this also was moved, and in really rather dubious circumstances, from Bamber to Peterborough Abbey shortly before the Norman conquest. You see there the amazing west front of what is now Peterborough Cathedral, but of course before the Reformation it was a Benedictine monastery. Now, because it's written in Bede's ecclesiastical history that Oswald's arm was at Bamber, and because Bede was, and I suppose still is, the great authority for early English history, Peterborough's claim to possess Oswald's arm excites a bit of comment. William of Malmesbury, for example, writing in the 12th century, tells us about a lot of saints' resting places, as they're called. And when he gets to Peterborough, he says that he doesn't want to claim that Oswald's arm is in Peterborough because he hasn't seen it with his own eyes. And then he goes on to qualify that he does believe that Oswald's arm is incorrupt, he's just not sure if it's actually at Peterborough. So you can see there's a little bit of kind of commentary starting to go on about Oswald's body parts moving around. Now, at Peterborough, the arm is installed in a chapel in the south transept that's dedicated to Oswald. This chapel here, you can see the Norman architecture in the inside much more clearly. And there's a little tower at the back of this chapel, and it's said that a monk watched from this chapel over Oswald's incorrupt arm night and day to guard it. And of course, they needed to guard it, and having stolen it themselves, they knew that it was an attractive proposition for people out for stealing relics. And they did need to look after it. Very soon after the Norman conquest, Oswald's arms actually carried away from Peterborough by Hereward the Wake, initially to Ely, then it finds its way to Ramsey Abbey, and it only comes back to Peterborough when the then abbot, a Norman called Thorold, threatens to burn Ramsey Abbey down. That's the only way they get the arm back. Another abbot, William de Waterville, was deposed in 1175, and it's said that he entered the abbey church with armed men and tried to carry off the arm of St Oswald, injuring some monks in the process. And right at the end of the Middle Ages, in 1515, when the Bishop of Lincoln visited the abbey, he had to discipline a brother, John Walpole, who had stolen jewels from the shrine of St Oswald and given them to women in the town. So you can see it's a precious relic that really does need guarding. The great 12th century chronicler of Peter Abbey, Hugh Candidus, and you can see him there in modern glass in Peterborough Cathedral. When he discusses Oswald's arm, he tells us only rather Delphically that Winnegot bought the arm of St Oswald from Bamber. He's not letting us have much more information there. But why did the monks want this relic so much they were prepared to steal it? I think that the answer is probably quite simple, and it's that they didn't have a really high-profile local saint of their own, and they wanted one that connected their community back to the early history of Christianity in England. Like Lindisfarne, the original monastery at Peterborough had been destroyed by the Vikings and had only been refounded in the 10th century. So Oswald's arm is really the most prestigious prize in a kind of larger campaign you can see them undertaking of relic acquisition, through which these monks are seeking to emphasize the antiquity and the prestige of their monastery. Now, Hugh tells us some other things about Oswald's arm. He tells us, for example, that King Stephen came to Peterborough to visit the arm. And he says that Stephen's shown the arm, and I think we have to understand from this that the arm is taken out of its reliquary and that the king can admire its kind of incorrupt status. Hugh tells us himself that he's washed the arm, that he's seen it incorrupt, that he's kind of cared for it. And Stephen gives the arm a ring, a gift. He gives the arm a ring, Hugh tells us. It just seems like a slightly strange idea, but I think we can see an analogy if we look at this reliquary of an arm This is a reliquary of St Blaise, now in Brunswick. So it's quite kind of usual for reliquaries to take on the shape of a body part that they have within them. And you can see this one is decorated with rings. And so I think when Hugh tells us that King Stephen gave the arm of Oswald a ring, we need to consider him to be talking about something like this. Hugh includes a story which points to some kind of liturgical use of the arm, which I found particularly interesting. This dates from the abbacy of Martin of Bec, who was abbot from 1133 to 55. He works very hard to rebuild the church after a big fire in 1116, and you can see that again depicted on this modern glass. Poor Hugh had to watch the abbey burn down. So during Martin's abbacy, on the feast of St Peter, who's of course the patron saint of Peterborough, relics along with Oswald's arm were brought into the newly completed chancel of the church in the presence of the Bishop of Lincoln, the abbots of Ramsey, Thorney and Crowland, and many monks, barons and knights. And he recounts that Oswald's arm was displayed to them. Again, I wonder if, it's coming out of its reliquary, but also that the bishop blessed all present with it. And here you have the kind of idea that he's actually physically, using this arm to make a gesture particularly. Again, Hugh doesn't really tell us that much, but it's certainly intriguing. To go back to how the arm came to Peterborough, we've seen that Hugh Candidus is a bit Delphic about what's going on, but by the 13th century, Henry of Avranches, who was commissioned to write a verse life of Oswald by the abbot and monks, he openly boasts about the theft of this relic. But a certain, I've lost what it says behind the screen. Is there any way I can move that? There we go. But a certain monk, a sanctioned robber, a faithful defiler, pious and guilty by one and the same deed, translated the right arm thence by furtive abduction to the cloister of Peterborough. Yet a wise man should take note that this was done by the will of God. The king had earlier desired to be venerated there, as in Bamber, but now preferred this place, Peterborough. For the clergy of that former place are diligent in the psalms, but this congregation more so. Well, to be fair to the monks of Peterborough, the evidence does suggest that they were extremely diligent when it came to commemorating Oswald in the liturgy. On the screen there, you can see a 14th century customary from Peterborough, which is now in Lambeth Palace Library. There's the calendar day for August. Oswald's feast is the 5th of August, his death date, and we can see here that it is celebrated as a principal feast. And this is a big deal. There are only 6 other feasts in the customary that are marked as being celebrated as principal feasts. Obviously, feasts, the movable feasts like Christmas and Easter would have been as well. But Oswald really is a kind of Premier League saint at Peterborough. And at Peterborough, the liturgy that was originally composed at Durham was elaborated. On this side of the screen is the 14th century antiphona from Peterborough, now at Magdalen College, Cambridge. And it takes that Durham liturgy and adds to it. It uses some chants which are taken from a liturgy otherwise only known on the continent. And this was probably first composed at the Flemish Abbey of Saint-Winoc in Bourges, and it's found in 6 other manuscripts, all of which are from German-speaking lands. And you have got an example of one of those up there on this side of the screen. And the way it's elaborated is that they add some additional chants in, so that the chants to be sung on his feast day and on the octave and within the octave are slightly different. So here we have the continental connection. How does Oswald become popular on the continent? Well, Bede claims that Oswald was already famous in Ireland and Germany by the time he was writing. And I think this is because of a kind of Irish, Northumbrian, Frisian missionary network. So we saw that Oswald summoned Aidan from Iona, and these Irish monks and Northumbrian churchmen also go into Frisia. St Willibrod, for example, is said to have taken relics of Oswald to Frisia. And Oswald's feast is found in the calendar from his foundation at Echternach, which is in modern day Luxembourg. You can see again, 5th of August, Oswald. And that's the very kind of typical Northumbrian kind of manuscript, which they take with them as well to the continent. But I think Bede's probably exaggerating a little bit, to be honest, as he's generally trying to big Oswald up. But the seeds that are planted by these Frisian missionaries are kind of watered and then finally really flourish in the High Middle Ages, thanks to 3 high status marriage alliances between members of the English royal and aristocratic families and German royal and aristocratic families across several centuries. So firstly, we have Edith. Edith is a daughter of Edward the Elder of Wessex and the half-sister of King Athelstan, and she married the great Saxon ruler Otto I in 929 or 930, and she's described in a German chronicle as being born of the blessed stock of King Oswald. So that association of Oswald obviously makes sense already in Germany. Secondly, we have Judith. Now, Judith is the widow of Tostig of Northumbria, who I'm sure most of you have heard of. He died at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066. And after his death, she married in 1071 the powerful German prince Welf IV of Bavaria. And we know that relics of Oswald were amongst a lavish endowment that Judith gave to the monastery of Weingarten, which had been founded by her husband. Weingarten is in southwestern Germany. Judith was also from the Flemish comital family, and we think probably actually that the Continental Liturgical Office originated at this monastery, which had very close associations with the Flemish comital family. So Judith not only has a devotion to Oswald from that, but then also she spent time in Northumbria with Tostig, and we know she was quite keen on a number of northern saints, although Oswald seems to have been the most important one. And finally, in 1168, the daughter of King Henry II of England, Matilda, married Henry the Lion, who was a member of the Welf dynasty as well, and the most powerful prince in Germany. And you can see their marriage depicted in this wonderful 12th century manuscript, the Gospels of Henry the Lion. There's Henry, there's Matilda, and there's her father, King Henry II of England. I like these 3 links and the 3 women, because it shows as well how important women were to cultural exchange in the Middle Ages, which I think is a very important thing to note. Now, Henry the Lion and Matilda were the most likely patrons and donors of the second of Oswald's head that I had on the screen on the opening slide. This is found at Hildesheim in Saxony, and is kind of contemporary with their marriage. The decorative programme points to English influence. There are other English kings. You can see next to Oswald here, St Edward being shown, and also the workmanship points to English influence. So that's why people have made the link to Matilda, but it was probably made in Lower Saxony. Lower Saxony has some of the best metalworking workshops of the Middle Ages. The inscription around the top, which is kind of this bit, is worth dwelling on a bit. Pious King Oswald gave himself and his possessions to Christ, and to the executioner his head, which is preserved in this gold. Well, we know that Oswald died in battle, whereas this has now become a kind of more explicit martyrdom. And this is a kind of thing you see in his cult in Germany, that Oswald's more explicitly presented as a martyr. He's recognized as a martyr in England, but just not quite so explicitly as we find it in Germany. Now, in 1182, the relics given by that second woman, Judith, were moved to be buried at Weingarten beside the burial vault of the founders. And in 1217, the church was rededicated to the Holy Cross, the Blessed Virgin Mary, St Martin, and St Oswald. And this dedication is reflected in the decorative programme On the jewelled cover of the so-called Berthold Sacramentary from Weingarten, which was made about the time that the church was rededicated, which is now in the Pierpont Morgan Library in New York. You can see, of course, the big cross, the Blessed Virgin Mary in the middle with the child. Here's Saint Martin, and here we have King Oswald. And you see he's holding this kind of covered plate, and that in German iconography represents that Easter feast plate, which is broken up. And it's called the Berthold Sacramentary after the abbot who commissioned it. And you can see just down here in the same quarter of Oswald is Abbot Berthold himself. But this is, I mean, a stunningly magnificent manuscript. And Oswald, unsurprisingly, also features prominently between the jewelled covers. This double page illumination, and I had the picture of the Easter feast up already, marks the start of his proper Mass. And this Welf foundation at Weingarten was really the centre of elite veneration of Oswald in German-speaking lands. And it's probably from Weingarten, and certainly through networks associated with this dynasty, the Welf, that Oswald's cult spreads. It's surely under their influence that Oswald's cult came to Switzerland. At All Saints Schaffhausen, a town on the Upper Rhine, which is due west of Weingarten, but just over the border in Switzerland, there's a first mention of a chapel dedicated to St Oswald in 1300. And here we find another claimant to Oswald's head. Schaffhausen claims to have a head relic of Oswald. By the 15th century, the most important centre of Oswald's cult in Switzerland was at Zug, which is kind of due south of Schaffhausen and the other side of Zurich. In the 1470s, a new church was built in the town, and it was dedicated to St Oswald. And the priest, who was called John Eberhard, set about collecting lots of relics for his new church. In 1481, he sent to Peterborough, and in return for his offering of 10 pennies, Eberhard received from the abbot a piece of cloth that had been wrapped around Oswald's incorrupt right arm and was therefore stained with the Northumbrian king's blood. In 1484, Eberhard obtained a finger of St Oswald's left hand for the abbot of Wettingen, and in 1485 he persuaded the monks at Weingarten to part with a piece of Oswald's arm that they had, so presumably something that had come from Judith. He also tried to get some of Oswald's head from Schaffhausen, but he was rebuffed. In 1502, his successor finally managed to obtain a fragment of Oswald's head from Schaffhausen. Now, the example of Zug is an interesting one, I think, because it demonstrates very clearly the strength of Oswald's cult at an elite level and the kind of ecclesiastical networks through which interest in Oswald is spreading, and how that's so linked to the possession of physical relics of the king. But alongside this elite level veneration, there was another popular strand of devotion to Oswald in German-speaking lands. And this is a lot harder to trace and very difficult to explain, because Oswald becomes the subject of a very unusual legend, which is transmitted in the vernacular, in which he becomes increasingly detached from Oswald, the historical figure. We find him, for example, described in one vernacular text as being a king of Norway, which must be a kind of leap from Northumbria, and also somewhere as a king of the Tyrol. And the story is quite fanciful. Well, it seems fanciful to us, though the fact that it continues to circulate with other saints' lives suggests that it probably wasn't as problematic for a medieval audience as it seems to modern scholars. Now, there are verse and prose versions of this legend. The longest and most developed is called the Munich Oswald, simply because the kind of most complete manuscript of it survives in Munich rather than any other link. And this is an explicitly funny text, as I'm going to tell you a bit in a minute. It's long been assumed that this legend originated in the 12th century in Regensburg, which was a town under Welf influence, but the arguments for this are very speculative. The truth is we don't know where or when all our manuscripts for this legend are much later than the 12th century. On the screen, though, you can see a 13th century statue of Oswald from Regensburg. He certainly was popular in the town. You can see again he's holding this cup, which alludes to the Easter feast, and in this arm he used to hold a scepter. And we know from an antiquarian drawing that there used to be, perched on the top of this cup, a raven holding a ring. Why would that be? Well, at the heart of vernacular Oswald legends is a story about the king seeking a wife. His advisors tell him that he must marry, but he doesn't know whom. A pilgrim arrives at his court and tells him about a suitable princess from a far-off land, and Oswald decides that he will marry her. But how can he woo a princess from far across the seas? Enter his talking raven. Oswald is surprised that his raven, who has lived at his court for 12 years, can suddenly speak. But he can, and he's a pretty demanding raven. He requests that his feathers be encased in gold and that a golden crown be made for him before he'll set out on his mission to woo the princess. He's also a very greedy raven, and I think this is really where the humour comes in. Food features a lot in this story. He refuses, for example, to pass on a message to King Oswald until he has been fed, given fine wine, and had a good sleep. I like this, I empathise with this approach. And when he's captured by a mermaid and dragged to the bottom of the sea, he manages to trick the mermaid into feeding him before he then escapes. And that's not the only time he manages to catch food off people. You can see that we've really left the historical Oswald and his Northumbrian context far behind us. Aside from the raven, one of the things that's most puzzling about the legend is the princess. To cut a long story short, Oswald eventually gets the girl, but then they have a completely chaste marriage and they sleep with a bucket of cold water at the end of their bed. If they feel frisky, they put their feet in the cold water and their urges pass. Now, kings need heirs, that's why kings get married, so a chaste marriage seems like a very strange motif. The historical Oswald did have a son. The first source to give his wife a name is Reginald of Durham in the 12th century, and I'm not sure we can really take what Reginald says as fact. Reginald mentions the son, but he says that then Oswald's marriage became chaste after his wife had produced an heir. Now, scholars have been very keen to see the origins of parts of German Oswald legends in Reginald's work, but I'm really very sceptical about this. Reginald's work, which is quite painful to read, to be honest, only survives in 2 manuscripts, neither of which left Durham before the dissolution. It's not a widely known text, and I think it's highly unlikely that it was ever known in Germany, and certainly not in such a way as it could have influenced popular stories like this. Instead, I think that the chaste marriage needs to be understood in a German context. We often find Oswald's cult in association with that of the King Emperor Henry II of Germany, who ruled from 1002 to 1024 and was canonized in 1146. So in the mid-12th century, just when Oswald's cult is starting to really gain ground in Germany. On the left of the screen there, or it's left for me, you can see a reliquary of Henry II, which was probably also made in the workshops of Lower Saxony. Here's Oswald and 2 other kings, Sigismund and a king nobody's ever heard of, and Christ in the middle, and on the reverse of this reliquary is depicted Henry II himself. Now, Henry II is married to Cunegunda, and they were childless. Their lack of an heir was an obvious problem, as it is for any king or emperor, but the couple had such a reputation for piety. Henry was the great patron of Bamberg, the Bamberg Cathedral, and lots of wonderful illuminated manuscripts. You can see part of one of those illuminations on the screen showing them both. And because they had such a reputation for piety, their childlessness was explained by their having a chaste marriage. And Kunigunde herself was canonized in 1200. So in German-speaking lands, the motif of a pious king with a chaste marriage was already quite prominent, and in elite veneration as well as in the popular Oswald stories. But why does the motif occur in Reginald and vernacular German legends, if I'm not inclined to think that one influenced the other? Well, to explain this, and I think to explain a lot of other things about medieval culture, we need to turn to the liturgy. For in the liturgy of Oswald's feast in England and in Germany, there's an explicit mention of the rejection of family, because the gospel for Oswald's feast day in both the monastic office and in the mass in England and in Germany is Luke 14:26 and following. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. You see, I think it's the reference to the cross which makes it such an appropriate gospel passage for Oswald. As we've seen, he held the cross himself at Heavenfield. But also within this text, we find that idea that you have to deny yourself, your wife and your children to follow Christ. And so that's, I think, what Oswald is doing in Reginald's text and in the German vernacular legend. And I think we can see here as well that popular and elite versions of Oswald aren't actually quite as divorced as they seem to us at first sight. Be that as it may, the vernacular Oswald legends certainly seem to supercharge the spread of this cult. It's not found just in elite ecclesiastical and lay centres like Weingarten and Regensburg, but in small alpine villages. A surprising number of villages in Austria are named for the saint. And the presence of the raven and the ring on these town shields demonstrates that the vernacular legend is absolutely essential to this spread. I have a kind of plan one day when it's possible to travel again to visit all these places named for Oswald in the Alps. And from the German-speaking Alps, Oswald's cult begins to spread further south. The incredibly remote village of Sauris, which is first mentioned in 1280, possessed a thumb relic of Oswald by 1328. And in the 1950s, this was still being processed through alpine pastures on his feast day with a statue of the king, and he's got his raven there on his shoulder, not so easy to see. Perhaps this is still going on. Again, I need to obviously go to the Alps and find out as a research trip one August. And from these alpine pastures, Oswald's cult slowly makes its way down to the northern Italian plains. The church of St Eustace on the south bank of the Grand Canal in Venice. It's an old church, but it was rebuilt towards the end of the 17th century and completed a little later by a facade with the aid of a legacy from the Doge. And on this facade, we find a mildly ecstatic King Oswald wearing a toga, somewhat surprisingly, and holding his raven. And we can be sure that this is Oswald because he's also depicted inside the church. And in fact, he is the subject of paintings in various churches in the Veneto by members of the Ciopilo family. I'm sorry, these aren't the best reproductions, but we've got here Oswald with his raven. Here again, Oswald, I can't remember where his raven's hiding in that picture. And here again, Oswald with his raven down there. So he's very far from Northumbria, and he's being imagined in a very different way. And then something that I think is particularly fun happens. The iconography of these German legends is re-imported back into England by the Victorians. Here's two examples of this iconography in stained glass, one by the pre-Raphaelite Edward Burne-Jones and one by the Reverend Ernst Geldart, who is a kind of priest architect who was an expert on church furnishings and decorations. And the ravens become quite a distinctive symbol of Oswald in England. We find him, for example, as the emblem for the St Oswald's Way, a long distance path inaugurated earlier this century, joining the site of his first battle at Heavenfield to Lindisfarne via Bamberg. And in the absence of an awareness of the German legend, people have tried to kind of graft the raven onto English versions of Oswald's story. And they've particularly picked up that legend in Reginald of Durham that I mentioned, that this big bird picks up the incorrupt right arm, carries it to an ash tree, where he drops it, a spring springs up. And because Woden is also associated with ash trees and springs and ravens, people kind of suggest that this big bird was a raven, but Reginald never really says that it was. I'm sure there were some kind of folkloric associations here, because Oswald is associated with quite a few holy springs as well. But the bird was really never a major part of the Oswald legend in England, and certainly not one that was ever represented visually. There's one 14th century, I think it is, window of Oswald at York Minster, where he's holding a bird. But if you look at the context of the wider window, there are quite a few kings depicted on it, and they're all, like several other of them, also have birds. So more likely that's a bird of prey, which is a kind of status symbol denoting a king, than it specifically being a raven for Oswald. So I think really we have to appreciate that this is the German raven, it's not an English tradition. And to me, I like the way this comes back, because it symbolises the many interactions between English and German speaking lands that we see in Oswald's cult over more than a millennium. Now I'm going to draw to a close here, and the observant amongst you will have noticed that I've made no mention of Oswald's fourth head in the Netherlands. I'm sorry I haven't had time for that. I've also not mentioned his popularity in Scandinavia, further east into Bohemia, but hopefully you've gained a pretty good idea of the extraordinary afterlife of this 7th century king. Earlier in the talk, when I was discussing the vernacular legends, I put up some slides which are part of an animation of the German legend that I developed with some colleagues, which uses imagery from the Peterborough Bestiary, so a manuscript from Peterborough, to tell this German legend. So again, bringing the kind of English and German elements together. This is free to watch online, so if you'd like to learn a bit more about the story, then please go to oswald'srex.co.uk/animation and have a watch. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Johanna. That was fascinating. And I don't know if you've been able to see, but there's been so many comments and questions coming in on Facebook. So thank you so much for that. I'm just going to stop screen sharing there. But everyone, as Johanna said there, do have a look at the animation there. We'll try and get a link posted into the chat so you can directly click through and watch it, because it's well worth going to have a look at. Now we're going to go into question time very shortly, everyone. So this is time where we'll be putting your questions to Johanna and trying to get you some answers. But as we said at the start of this lecture, if you're enjoying these lectures, which are always free of charge, please do consider supporting us in our mission to save and conserve a growing collection of historic churches in England. At the moment, we have 356 churches in our care, but this number is very likely to grow. And as a result of the pressures that COVID-19 has put on rural parishes across the country, we are looking at more churches coming our way. So your support is really important and needed. So you can donate by sending a text message. As I said, you can text CCT to 70331, and that will give us a gift of £3. But if you think it's worth a bit more, you can text CCT to 70970 to give us a gift of £5. Or, as we said at the start of the lecture, you can donate through our website, or you can join us as a member from CCT by direct debit from just £3.50 a month. And if you use the code LECTURE when you sign up, we will send you a free copy of this wonderful book, Beautiful Churches. So do have a look at that. But if you've got any questions, do let us know. Now, I'm going to jump into questions, everyone. So the first question that's come in, how certain are we that Oswald was killed near Oswestry? There is a legend that he was killed on the Isle of Axholme in North Lincolnshire, near Low Burnham, where there is a holy well. We also have several churches dedicated to St Oswald. Do you have any thoughts on that, Johanna?
I think I caveated it when I said it would possibly or probably, depending on who you think to, and I'm afraid, not being an early medieval archaeologist, I don't really have a particularly good answer to the question, I'm afraid. To me, because I'm kind of more interested in what happens afterwards, the fact that both of them have those legends attached to them is very interesting, and that they're linked again with kind of springs is pretty interesting. But I'm afraid I couldn't opine on which I think was more likely.
Fair enough. And could you give us, there were lots of people commenting about the box you showed us, where we thought it might have been St Oswald's head on the front. Do you have any more information about the box? I think it was from one of the German museums you showed, with Oswald on the front, and it had the head of king on the top of it.
I'm not quite sure which it meant me.
I think it was the reliquary one that you had on your intro slide, and you
with the head at the top.
That's it.
So this reliquary is kind of augmented bit by bit. So the head that's on the top, as it were, is later. I think it's 14th century, and it has a combination of kings. There's Edward, Alfred, Ethelwald, Canute, Ethelbert, Edmund, and Sigismund. Sigismund of Burgundy we often find with Oswald as well. Quite why he travels with particular saints, I haven't particularly been able to work out. But if you have a Google for that reliquary, which is in Hildesheim, you can find some quite nice material about it online if you're interested.
Thank you, Anna. And you've obviously talked about some of the dedications that St Oswald has in England, and two of them are in our care. Someone's asked the question is, how popular was St Oswald as a dedication for medieval churches? Are they concentrated mainly in the northeast of the country, or are they generally scattered across the country due to where his relics were?
So they are mostly in the north. I mean, 80 churches is a decent number. Obviously, it's not up there with kind of Mary or one of the universal saints, but for an English saint, it's not a bad number. They are predominantly in the north, but not exclusively, and they do tend to cluster around places where, like Gloucester, where there's a interest in him. Around Gloucester, there's maybe 5 or 6 Oswald dedications, not just Lassington. There's the odd one in Sussex, which is where one of the Northumbrian churchmen, Wilfrid, founded a monastery, and there's a miracle to do with Oswald in Bede associated with this in Sussex. So there's kind of interest in him there. But aside from parish church dedications, one of the other things that's kind of a bit more difficult to assess is chapels dedicated to him in bigger churches. So one of the things I've found in my research is that he was actually quite an important saint at St Paul's in London, for instance. People had already noticed that there was a altar to him in the crypt at St Paul's, but also some of the water that had been used to wash Oswald's incorrupt arm is taken to St Paul's in London, and then many miracles occur there. So again, you see how these things kind of spread with some kind of miraculous relics. But Oswald dedications are much more common in the north, but you do find them clustered around places like Gloucester as well, where there's other interest in Oswald.
And you briefly just touched on the incorruptible arm that you mentioned about, and we've had a question come in saying, do we have any idea of what actually happened eventually to that arm? Was it lost at the Reformation? Was it destroyed, or has it just been lost to history? Well,
I suspect it was destroyed, but when I have been at Peterborough talking with some of the canons there's a suggestion, it's probably buried somewhere, which could be true. There's no record of its destruction or record of, the shrine must have been fantastic, but it hasn't been seen since the Reformation. Whether the monks did hide it somewhere so well that nobody ever found it, or whether it was just destroyed, I'm afraid we don't know. It's one of those kind of great conundrums, and it's such a, as with so much that was destroyed at the Reformation, it's so kind of frustrating not to be able to visualize what this arm looked like in its shrine and in its setting.
And well, obviously we've just mentioned there Peterborough, and just sort of touching before the Reformation, obviously there are famous people buried there, so like Catherine of Aragon, Mary Queen of Scots was initially buried there. During sort of the just before the Reformation, was there still a sense of pilgrimage going to the cathedral, to the abbey at that time, to go and venerate his relics, do you think?
Well, this isn't something that I have particularly looked into, but I mean, I would have thought so, because, John Eberhard in 1481 in Zug knows that, in Switzerland, knows that Peterborough is the place to go to get some more kind of Oswald relics. So I think by the later Middle Ages, Oswald is kind of perhaps less important in England than he's become in Germany in a strange way. He kind of gets eclipsed by people like St Edmund, for example. He becomes a more important royal saint than St George. So I don't think he's quite so popular in England by the end of the Middle Ages, to be honest. But I would have thought there would still be people visiting his army. Yeah.
And in terms, it's been really interesting seeing how this cult spread from northeast England down the rest of the country over into continental Europe. Do you think in that ways, St Oswald is quite a unique success as an export of an English saint and being really popular in continental Europe? Or do you think there were other saints who were just as popular as he was on the mainland?
No, it is quite unusual. I think the only English saint who was more popular than Oswald is Thomas Becket, basically, on the continent. What's quite funny about Oswald, though, is that the French aren't interested in him at all. Like, there's nothing about Oswald in France. It's really a kind of Anglo-German, Scandinavian interest. Whereas Becket, of course, is also ends up being popular in France. But no, he is a kind of successful export in that sense, definitely, and more than most other English saints.
I think we've got time for a couple more questions, but what's your favourite church dedicated to St Oswald that you've come across?
I'm afraid I'm going to go for the chapel, and it has to be Peterborough. Peterborough is such a mind-blowingly wonderful place, and if you haven't visited Peterborough Cathedral, you should hot-foot it there as soon as COVID allows, because it's a wonderful place. And I think it's, for me, because I'm interested in the way that the cult spreads, that's a place that really symbolises how this starts to happen, how he starts to leave Northumbria and go off on the journeys he goes on. So yeah, that's the place I have the biggest soft spot for.
Thank you, Anna. And I think for a final question that we're going to look at here for today is someone's mentioned here, sorry, I'm just reading this if I got this right. There was a bit of conversation about Chester-le-Street, what you'd said, and Chester itself, and someone said, didn't Cuthbert's body rest at Chester-le-Street rather than Chester on his journey to Durham? There's a church of St Mary and St Cuthbert there, and was where the Lindisfarne Gospels also rested, as the monks annotated them into English.
Yeah, no, that's right. Sorry, I've been lazy by not saying Le Street when I should have. It was indeed at Chester-le-Street where they pause. Absolutely.
Brilliant. Well, thank you ever so much for answering those questions, Johanna, and thank you everyone for those really interesting questions and also for your suggestions that have come in. So rest assured, we're going to try and get you a lecture on reliquaries and relics. So leave that with us and we'll try and slot something in. But thank you again, Johanna, for taking time to talk to us today. We will post, everyone do pre-order Johanna's book. We've posted a link, we'll post it again. And also do check out those animations. Now, as I said, we've got some more lectures coming up. Do check our events page. But you can see our upcoming talk. So next week, we're going to be looking at the really interesting topics of rood screens. So join us for next week for A Rood Awakening, pun intended there, for the pride of the parish church. And that's with Richard Heyman, who's written several books about the topic. And I'm just seeing if I've got it down here, and I haven't got it by me, but there is a book that he's written. He's going to be talking to us about rood screens. So do join us next Thursday at 1 p.m. for our next lunchtime lecture. But as always, thanks everyone for joining us. If you've got ideas for future lectures, please do comment away, send us messages, because we really appreciate your suggestions, and we will do our best to try and sort something out. But if you've joined us for the first time, do let us know. We hope you've had a great time. But once again, thank you for joining us today, and thank you, Johanna, for joining us. And we look forward to seeing everyone at another Thursday lunchtime lecture in the future. Take care, everybody.